there a sense that there are constructive conversations happening, that could be light at the end of the tunnel, a deal perhaps anytime soon, given that the U.S. did strike a deal with Mexico, with Canada?
I think the fact that that deal was struck is illustrative. So there is a possibility of coming to agreements, but all sides have to be in a position to negotiate that. They have to want the deal. I think this effort that we have with the trade tensions out there and the U.S. and China big players there, I think you have to look at the bilateral conversations. I'm not sure it's going very far at this point in time, but there are also other efforts. Leaders are talking about a reform of the WTO that could address some of the concerns that, in particular, the U.S. has been expressing, but also China has been expressing, and other members. That conversation, because it's not fully bilateral, it is a win-lose situation, could offer potential to reduce the trade tensions as well.
You talked about your willingness to mediate. How far have you gotten? Have you managed to get through between the two sides?
Well, getting this conversation started was already important. I had several conversations with global leaders on both sides of the Atlantic and the Pacific, and I think the fact that these leaders now are engaged in this conversation, they all want to find a solution, and they all think that the WTO, for example, could be a place where this conversation could happen. That conversation is beginning to take place. Not with all WTO members. Some, at least, are talking about this, and this is something that gives me reason for optimism.
The U.S., in particular, President Trump has said that the WTO has to take action on what it terms as disruptive trade practices if it wants to stay relevant. Your thoughts on how you can respond?
I think what the U.S. is saying is essentially the disciplines that we have today, the rules that we have today in the WTO, they don't capture some types of distortive measures that are put in place by others. They mentioned the case of industrial subsidies, they mentioned intellectual property rights, they mentioned a whole bunch of things, frankly. And they think that the WTO has to reform, so the rules have to change, be adapted to capture those things, like state-owned enterprises and things like that. Others have other things that they would like to discuss, too. I think that is the kind of conversation that is beginning at this point in time.
Some within the WTO have said that there's been some kind of bullying by President Trump on the WTO, and they've called on for members to be united against President Trump. How do you view those comments?
I think we have to begin to change the dynamics of the conversation between confrontation, switch it from confrontation to cooperation. I think we already had a number of countermeasures. So a country imposes some measure, then somebody else imposes another one, and there is a response to that and a response to that. This is a never-ending domino effect, and I don't like that. I think the way to move now is to get into a situation where we're talking to each other rather than at each other. And I think we're beginning to see the contours of that conversation.
There are some concerns about the Appellate Body. You've gone from 7 judges to 3, and some are saying that you can't afford to lose one more, or that's the end of the whole process. Why has it been so difficult? And is the U.S. Putting a lot of pressure on the choices of judges?
The U.S. has been complaining about the work of the Appellate Body for some time, this administration more forcefully, and now they're blocking the appointment of replacements for the Appellate Body members that are leaving. By the end of next year, we would go down to 2 Appellate Body members. At that point in time, it will not be enough to hear any appeals. So if you have a dispute and it reaches the appeal level, it stops right there. So there is no adoption of the report, which essentially paralyzes the system of dispute settlement. Now, this is something that members are still discussing. There is no light at the end of the tunnel for this. Members are talking about alternatives, what we do.
Are you at
if we
risk of a crisis?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. There's no doubt about that. But I don't think that members are crossing their arms and waiting for that crisis to happen. They're already talking and discussing how to fix it.
We've been talking about how that could be a prolonged trade war between the U.S. and China, and that will have a spillover effect. China accounts for 40% of global trade. what are your thoughts? Would you have to rethink your trade growth projections again should the war gets prolonged?
If it escalates, yes, absolutely.
What kind of numbers are we looking at?
I don't know. But if we, for example, but those numbers, it depends. It's very speculative. But my economists at the WTO, they looked at a full-blown trade war. In a situation like that, 17.5% of trade would disappear. That's a huge number. In terms of GDP growth, global GDP growth, 1.9 percentage points would come down. So if the expansion of the GDP would be 4%, with a full-blown trade war, it will go down to 2.1% on average, globally. Some countries will be more affected than others, but big countries like the U.S., China, they would be heavily affected by that. But it's difficult to tell because it depends on the degree of the measures, on how widespread they are. So it's a bit speculative, but what is important to note is that there will be an impact. That's for sure, and it will hurt everybody.